I'm very happy that you've joined me here again in the warm confines of my basement library. And I quickly wanted to go through a bit of a recap in case you haven't seen videos 1 and 2, which I hope you will take the time to fully understand the point I'm going to be making today, which is a little bit controversial. It's important that you do at least get a general sense of where I'm coming from. But I will recap it quickly for you. In our previous videos, we talked about the situation and why I even decided to do this series of videos again in the first place. Not again, a second time. Not a second time. Good grief. I'm on a roll today. Last year, I did a different series of videos on the need for courage and resilience in stories and how we could find that courage and resilience from the stories that we read. The reason that I chose that series last year was because, as I talked about in video 1, it was a fairly simple story that we were living out. I'm not in any way, shape suggesting that it was easy to live through the early days of the pandemic. It certainly was not. But I've made the argument, and people have agreed with me, that the story that we were living in was a rather simple one, in the sense that there was a common enemy that everybody had to fight against. And there was one way in which we were going to do that. And the thing that we needed to find wasn't so much a way out of the story that we were living, but it was a way of getting through it. Kind of a traditional quest narrative. There was a dragon or a beast out in the wilderness. That was COVID. And we were all heroes, or the hero's helpers, on a quest to try to overcome the difficulties of this journey, which would lead us eventually to a place where we would defeat this beast. And the important thing was to have the courage and the resilience to be able to get through that journey. That was an easy story to live through because we have a lot of models of that kind of storytelling. Unfortunately, as time went on, things got more complicated. And as I made the point that Paul Kingsnorth, the wonderful writer and thinker, now identifies that there are two stories that we are living through. And depending on which story you subscribe to will determine largely how you act, will determine largely how you interact with people around you. And the two stories that he identified, and I completely agree with him on this, is the plague story, which is a story that in which we believe that we are in the midst of a terrible plague, and there are enemies out there that are getting in the way of our very well-intentioned leaders and public health professionals who are doing some things that are perhaps a little bit authoritarian, but all for the benefit of us, and all with the intention of stopping those authoritarian things as soon as this particular evil is overcome. In this story, the bad guy, there are two bad guys, two villains. One is the plague itself, and the other is the silly, stupid, horrible people that get in the way of all those well-intentioned public health professionals and government ministers who are trying to do everything possible to save the largest number of people. The other story is the turnkey totalitarian story. And this is a story that people who believe they are in it do not see the public health professionals and our leaders as well-intentioned. They see them as ultimately power-hungry and corrupt. And they see this particular situation, the pandemic, or many of them will say that it isn't a pandemic, but rather a plandemic. They see it as an opportunity. They see the elites as taking this opportunity to enact some very long-planned, soft totalitarian surveillance systems that are now being unfurled and unrolled through such things as vaccine passports and things like that, that at any moment, even if and when the pandemic will wind down, they can still continue to extend their influence and power by simply turning on the system of surveillance that they've now established. Now, I am explaining again these two stories because they very well describe how most people are seeing this second year of the pandemic. I'm not saying I'm subscribing to either one of the stories. The point I'm trying to make here is that no matter what story you think you are in, there's one thing that is absolutely sure, is that either one of those stories or both those stories are very divisive. They very strongly create an other, and this is an other that you can find on the streets outside of your house. It's not a boogeyman other that lives somewhere out there in the darkness that you don't see on an everyday level. This is an other that is right in front of you every day. So this causes a real problem, and this is part of why we're seeing a continuation of the disintegration of our culture and the increasing fragmentation of society down even to the level of the family. And I further, in the second video, I further extended this discussion on storytelling by talking about how this culture's storytelling methods, the kinds of stories that our cultural elites tend to tell. Now, this is already no longer talking about the story of our lives, but the stories that we see in movies and read in contemporary literature, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of stories have a problem in that very often, not very often, but there's been a preponderance, or rather an increase of the use of the trauma plot. Now, this was a controversial point that I made in video 2, and do watch the video if you want to understand what I'm getting at in a little more detail. I'm not going to break it down here. But my point is that there is a definite danger and a problem in this culture storytelling choices, in that very often trauma becomes a kind of complete identity in itself. And the stories that we tell ourselves and that our cultural elites tell us, instead of providing, as it used to be the case always, a way through the trauma, through the wonderful technique of storytelling resolution, very often the trauma kind of stays, and the characters who are in the trauma remain in the trauma as a kind of matter of pride. Again, this is a controversial point. Some people responded to it negatively, and I will talk more about it in future videos, because my point is not that trauma doesn't exist or that we should minimize it, but that the storytelling choices that we are taking right now in this particular moment do not tend to emphasize a healthy or a particularly useful way through the trauma process. And this is where, and the reason for that, I argue, is that the trauma plot and the other stories that we are living in real life, so to speak, they tend to emphasize divisions, but they don't merely emphasize those divisions. They actually also reveal existing divisions among us. So they don't simply create them. So this is a matter of simply teaching someone else to tell a better story, or to uncover the wrongness of another story by producing your own facts or your own storytelling tradition. It's not simply that. What's happening right now, and I think many people are resonating with this idea, is that it's the pandemic and the stories we tell about it are revealing that we as human beings have become, especially in the prosperous West, have become very rootless, have lost the connection to family, connection to community, connection to nation, connection to higher power, higher cause, higher values. And instead of that, what we are encouraged to do is rather to create our own identities, to create our own values, to put in a lot of work on self-authoring, on the process of making for ourselves the best kind of story. This is a good thing. To write your own story is something that all of us not simply must do, but it's something that we do on a daily basis. That's part of the point that I'm making. We are storytelling creatures, and we do not interact with the world out there through facts, but through stories. But the problem is that since we are rootless, we can try no matter how much. We can constantly try to create our own story, but we're always going to come up against the fact that that story is going to change as soon as an external force comes in and changes our way of relating to the world, because we don't have roots. So as soon as there's a strong wind blowing from any direction, we're going to change our values. We're going to change our stories. We're not going to be rooted in something that is larger than we are, something that can give us meaning from outside of ourselves. And this is why I made the argument in the last video that what we need to do is to start moving away from this individualistic way of relating our story to the story of the world. How do we do that? Well, we do that first by moving away from our own personal story as a self-authoring experiment and moving towards the experience of being in the world of fairy tales. Because what fairy tales do is they break down your own solipsistic individuality, the individuality that you have that is buffered from everyone else, that is not connected to anyone else, that is not rooted in a community or in a storytelling tradition, which we don't have a storytelling tradition here in America. So we are rootless by default when it comes to that. So what the fairy tale does, it takes human psychological realities and it gives them an archetypal role to play. So we enter into a different world. And this is especially emphasized, for example, in the Russian fairy tale tradition, where often what happens before you even listen to a fairy tale, you listen to something called the pre-tale. The pre-tale is a very interesting thing. It's a bunch of nonsense situations or mini stories, some of which are violent, some of which are very colorful, but they all are told with the intention of pulling you, the listener, out of your everyday regular reality and making you aware of the fact that this is a world that you're entering that has nothing to do with your own personal wants and desires. You have to break yourself down. You're entering into a different space, a space in which the human experience, as it has been unfolded to humanity for thousands of years, is retold in a different language. Not in the language of the mind, not in the language of the brain, but in the language of the heart. And the language of the heart understands the world through vast, sweeping brushstrokes. So you have situations where a character is not simply a human being or a person that is working out his own internal psychological motivations. In a fairy tale, more likely than not, a character is representative of a larger idea. So you have Prince Ivan, the one who keeps doing stupid things and having to atone for them in ridiculous and sometimes very painful ways. He is not a single person with the specific internal desires and motivations that we're supposed to empathize with. No, he is every man, capital E. And by every man, I mean every person, of course. And for example, another example of this would be the figure of the princess, for example, in the story of Prince Ivan and the Grey Wolf. The princess doesn't speak anything throughout the entire story. She doesn't do anything. She doesn't have any agency. She is there as kind of, and some people take offense at this and say, well, this, why should we be reading or listening to these fairy tales when they are so clearly of a patriarchal, from a patriarchal world where the agency of women is denied. But actually what's going on there is that in that particular story, the princess is not playing the role of a woman. She's playing the role of the desired one, not necessarily even womanhood, but because it's a prince looking for a princess, that's who she is in that particular tale. But that archetype, the archetype of the one, the person, the idea to be striven for, that is outside of yourself and greater than yourself, and that pushes you to do crazy and self-transforming things. It could be anyone or anything. In this particular situation, it's the princess. So you see, what ends up happening is that the fairy tale, since it speaks in an entirely different language, and this is the language of the heart, it ends up doing something very interesting. It roots you, the individual listener, in a world that connects others throughout space and throughout time, because these stories have been shared and continue to be shared over many, many centuries. So at that moment, you are no longer the suffering individual in a world of trauma and in a world of confusion and in a world of pain and ugliness. You are now a human being in a world that makes to reveal itself to you in the way that it actually is. And this is what's so wonderful about fairy tales, is the fairy tales aren't simply arbitrary stories. They are manifestations of the way that the world truly is, in a that manifests itself in a way that the human being can understand most directly through the heart. These are the points that I've already made in previous video, but really I'm trying to put it all together as we move forward, because what's going to happen now is that we can't simply stay in this broken down state where our individual desires, needs are subsumed into the larger world, the archetypal world of fairy tales. We need to move from that state of rootedness, back into ourselves, because we are the ones that have to live this life. We are the ones that have to make the choices in the story of our life as it unfolds itself in front of us. And this happens by making a journey from the world of fairy tales because we shouldn't just limit ourselves to reading fairy tales and nothing else. There is other literature, there are other stories that can help us more fully engage our personal selves in the world that surrounds us without losing the rootedness that is given to us by fairy tales. This occurs actually as a historical moment when the fairy tale tradition gave way, or rather opened up the road to something new, something else. And I got this, the framework that I'm going to be talking about, from a really interesting book called Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher. Now, Angus Fletcher has been showing up a lot in my reading, and also in the conversations that I've been having with people on my podcast and in other videos that I've done for this channel and for other people's channels. Angus Fletcher is a fascinating guy. He's a neuroscientist who specializes in the science of storytelling. He's the kind of guy that puts people inside fMRI machines to scan their brains to see what happens when they read, before they read, after they read, and then makes certain determinations about, the way the brain is wired for story. I've talked about this sort of thing before, and I want to delve into that a little bit more, because Angus Fletcher has a really interesting contribution, I think, to make to this whole conversation about stories and how we relate to them and how they can help us live in a way that doesn't divide us from everyone else, which is the whole point of this video series. The point that he's especially interesting to me because he shows up in different places, and everywhere he shows up, he talks about the same thing, about how stories have the tendency to unify rather than divide, how stories are intrinsic to cultures and how they can do more than simply provide a template for behavior, but they can actually effect physiological and biological changes in people based on the kinds of stories that they encounter. And this was particularly interesting to me because he started to talk about epic poetry. And I'm going to read a few quotes from his book because he says he has a very interesting writing style. And although there are some things that he writes that I absolutely disagree with, he has a very strict Darwinian scientific worldview. It's very clear, very open about it. He makes no bones about it. And I respect him for having a consistent worldview. But there are some things, for example, the way I tend to look at this kind of research is not that the findings that these neurobiologists make about brain activity during storytelling, it doesn't. So when people say things like the brain is wired for story, right, or we human beings are wired or biologically determined to see our world through the medium of story, which is the kind of thing that people like Angus Fletcher say. When I hear that, I hear a very deterministic view of human nature, that human beings don't have a choice, that somehow they've been programmed through evolution, through their own biology, to live in this certain way. Now, I think it's just as valid to say that what the scientists see in the studies that they make is simply a manifestation on a biological level of a truth about human nature that is also expressed at a much deeper level, that not simply on the level of the brain, but on the level of human interaction, on the level of the heart. So it's not that these things have been programmed into us by an impersonal force. These are the expressions of what it means to be human. And so they are reflected on a biological level as well as a level beyond biology. And that's where I'm more interested in looking at it. But here's what he has to say about the the invention, as he calls it, of epic heroic poetry. He says that there was a storytelling breakthrough that occurred about 5 millennia ago, which is, take it as you will. He calls it the written narrator. So this is his idea. Stories were always told orally. People didn't read stories. They listened to stories. But at a certain point, there was a device that was invented, as he calls it an invented device. This was a method of taking the oral storyteller's voice and putting it with all of its idiosyncrasies, with all of its personality, into a written form. Here's what he says. He says the literary narrator, which is the narrator that has a point of view, was a seeming impossibility. It existed as inertly monotone script upon a printed page, and yet through the tools of style and focus, it could warmly emote, or solemnly articulate, or fearfully whisper, or dryly remark, or do anything else that a living mouth could do. So what ends up happening is the effect that you have sitting around a campfire, listening to a storyteller tell a story that really unites everyone together, is now replicated in the written word. And this couldn't have been guessed that this would have happened. This is a kind of what he says is this is a kind of a revolution. Now, it's also true, and I should mention that people didn't read the written word as people didn't sit and have personal interactions with written stories until much later, much until after the Iliad was written. His point was that Homer was one of the first people to actually use the storytelling device, and the storytelling device as used in Homer's Iliad is one that is really interesting, because what it does is it takes the shared experience of singing a song, in this case a song of battle, but that is directed towards the God that you are asking, the God that you are asking to intercede for you during this battle. It's taking that form, which is a wonderfully powerful emotional form. If you've ever been in a choir, or if you've ever been in a place where people are singing together, you'll understand the power of this. And Angus Fletcher, what he's talking about is that Homer was able to take that effect and make it into a literary device. The literary narrator who speaks with a divine voice, because when you are having this interaction with the written word, that voice is talking to you as if it is the voice of God. So what ends up happening then? His point is that by reading these paeans, as he calls them, which are hymns directed at a divinity, by reading them one-on-one, you and the written text, you actually have the experience physiologically of being in a battle with other people going into war. And that has an effect of actually, in actual practical fashion, of increasing your courage in a way that is demonstrably shown by the brain chemicals in your brain. Like, they can actually measure, and that's where the neuroscience comes into all this, but they can actually measure that by reading the Iliad, you become more courageous. This is an amazing thing. I mean, to me, it was just fascinating, because I had an intimation that this is true. I think we all knew it on a very intrinsic level, that when you read literature, you empathize with the emotions of those whom you read about. But he puts it down to a very specific literary technique, the invention of a narrator that has a voice. And what that narrator does is brings you out of yourself and puts you back into a community, but it's a community that is virtual in a sense. So if you don't have the opportunity of being in a choir that is going to war and feeling that kind of courage, you can still be courageous by reading those things. And that's true of a lot of different emotions. That's true of love. That's true of the strongest kind of compassion and empathy. And it's just simply a fact. It's a truth that is now demonstrated by the miracles of modern science, if you want to put it that way, that reading this kind of literature, specifically epic heroic poetry, can do the thing that is necessary for us to start integrating ourselves back into the world that is ugly and horrifying. So many of us have been faced by this, have faced this pandemic with fear, have faced the reality of the world that is forming around us with no real understanding of how we're going to move forward. That's why we've divided ourselves into these stories that are divisive by nature. But what if we started to tell ourselves a different story? What if we reconnected with the ancient epics? This could be the Iliad, could be the Odyssey, could be the Aeneid, it could be the Scandinavian epics, it could be Russian epic heroic poetry, it could be some biblical poetry. It could be all kinds of things. I think the important thing here is that it have the kind of epic heroic narrative structure that Angus Fletcher talks about in Wonderworks. This is a natural movement upwards, so to speak, from the fecund soil of the storytelling tradition as it is expressed in fairy tales. But it's a specification of it. It's a more specific manifestation of it. It's a kind of distillation of the power of the earth into a specific and single flower, right? We talked about flowers in the previous video. I think that's what's happening here. And I think that really makes it important for us to re-engage with the epics of the past. There's a reason that they are still around. There's a reason that Beowulf was recently retranslated by a modern poet into a form that is more readable, a form that is more appealing to contemporary audiences. It's because these stories have been passed on and have been remembered. And the reason that they've been remembered is because they continue, I think, to have the same effect on people from generation to generation to generation. This used to be something that we received with our mother's milk, let's be honest, especially if we live in the West. This would have been part of a regular diet or of instruction in schools. And is it surprising then that we're having such a crisis of young people when this particular generation, the one that sometimes we laugh at for wanting safe spaces in college, they didn't have the steady diet of the ancient classics that the previous generation did, even the my generation did. And I think we're seeing the results of that. So this is the thought I'd like to leave you with. There is a specific thing that you can do that can begin to reanimate your internal world in a way that will make you, me, all of us, more ready to step back into the world outside of the safe confines of our home, so that we can then start telling a new story about where we are and what we are doing. What is that story? What role are we going to play in it? We're going to talk about that more in further videos. But I wanted to finish with one thought. There was one of my listeners pushed back on my recommendation for the Iliad, saying, what do I have in common with a bunch of men in armor who are going off to chop other people's heads? Not incidentally, the person who said this was a woman. And I'm not making, this is an important point that I think that needs to be made, is that yes, there is something to say about the preponderance of the hero's journey in a lot of these stories, and how sometimes the hero's journey can be a little bit one-sided. I'm in no way saying that you shouldn't read or listen to the Iliad. I am saying that in our modern context, an excessive emphasis on the hero's journey can actually be damaging. That's going to be the topic of a future video. I think that's going to be a very interesting one because it's something that I haven't talked about ever before. I'm a big fan of the hero's journey, of the heroic quest, but I have done some reading and done some thinking, and now I think that actually there could be some nuance to the way that all of us talk about the storytelling world, about storytelling structures, and maybe, just maybe, there is some room for something called the heroine's journey. But we're going to talk about that more next time. I do thank you very much for listening. And I wanted to remind you that if you want to have a say, comment, throw insults at me as I do these videos, I'm actually featuring these videos to my Patreon supporters live before I send them out to my newsletter. I am eventually going to re-record these and make them available to everyone, but you, my newsletter subscribers, get it first. And if you want to have input on how I actually on what I say, and if you want to actually comment and direct the flow of these stories, and maybe even have input in where I go from here on out, there are going to be at least 2 more videos after this one. Join my Patreon community, because I do this with them in a very intimate way. I really appreciate their input. And if you'd like to join them, I'd be very happy to see you there. That's at patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar. But until then, go get yourself a copy of Seamus Heaney's Beowulf at the very least. I think you're going to come through it with a different experience of what it means to be human. That's what I'm going to leave you with today. Thanks very much.